And I guess my apologies, but at the same time, it's not my fault. We were looking at surrealism in America and looking at sort of similarities between Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe, in that both of them are very interested in natural phenomena, and then sort of exploiting that and investigating that on a very, very personal set of terms that pushes them beyond simple representation and into forms of abstraction derived from nature. So it's very close in spirit to early expressionism, people like Kandinsky, for example. And so, Dove looks at the heavens and thinks of music and sees these forms and translates these forms into a sort of experiential painting. And O'Keeffe gives us these images of flowers that end up sort of tapping into a broader pantheistic feminism, such as the Jack in the Pulpit picture on the right. We have two other Americans I really want to look at quickly, simply because they loom fairly large and they're well represented around here, that fit into this American surrealist mold. The first of them is not showing up on the screen. Hang on a second. Here it goes. There we go. Alexander Calder, who you've probably heard of before, the Mobile guy. And I'm sorry, this picture, it's a very small little wire sculpture he did. It's so cute, especially with the wire cow pie, right? It's charming, but you can see how small it is because the depth of field on my camera, right, didn't get the head in focus, even though the guts are in focus. And unlike O'Keeffe and Dove, well, it's not true. Calder goes to Paris right in the middle of the surrealist movement, and he's swept up with the surrealists. They love his work. And he begins doing these sort of animatronic, sort of childish constructions on arriving in Paris. Now, Dove went to Paris, but he went to Paris back around the time of Kandinsky, right? He went to Paris back around the time of 1910-ish, right? Just before Cubism breaks. So when he's doing these sort of surrealist things, it's not like he's tapping into contemporary Parisian surrealism in the same way, right? He knows of it because everybody does, but he knows of it through different sources. Calder goes, 1926, 27 or so. Calder spends 2 or 3 years in Paris. And not only does he see the surrealists, but actually, and we don't have time to get into this, he visits Piet Mondrian and does some amazing, I didn't know this until last year, some amazing sort of paintings in the spirit of De Style, but not really, in a sort of personal take on it. So anyway, he winds up in Paris in the late 20s, and he's phenomenally popular amongst the surrealists who see his sort of childlike whimsy that he has as tapping directly into some of the ideas that the Parisian surrealists had been dealing with, which are these ideas of sort of rooting out your, the sort of Freudian idea of rooting out what happens in childhood as to better understand how to, deal with being an adult, right? And where all of our issues sort of begin at that very early stage. And so Calder seems to be tapping back into that, although I don't think from his motivations that Calder gives a rip about Freudian psychoanalysis. I think it's really just kind of fun. And I think on a certain level, for me at least, he shares quite a bit in spirit with Paul Klee, right? Who also sort of fits into a lot of the surrealist ideas, but at the same time, there's something about the work that has innocence, right? And whimsy. That's a kind of sophisticated innocence at the same time. And so anyway, these wire sculptures, there's quite a few of them, heads and whatnot. They're just really fantastic. How with just bent wire he can get the entire cow to sort of come across. And what really jazzed the surrealists is that one of the first things he did was he had this little circus made out of wire figures and cut pieces of things. And it was animated, right? And he would roll out these, and he would do these little performances with these little figures kind of hopping around and moving. And he redid it in the 60s, and there's a video. So I've got that for you, which is kind of, I think it's worth spending 5 minutes watching Calder do his circus. So I'm going to try and see if that'll let me do it or not. Should there now pop up. We'll see how good my Wi-Fi connection is, right? There's like an 18-minute version of this as well, Brian. You start to wonder if, like, remember that Monroe picture we saw of the horse trainer that had sort of circus motifs that might pull into this as well, and also maybe even thinking back to things like Picasso and his circus entertainers as well as being this motif, right? The circus is this great motif for modernists as a place where the rules of society disappear for a while, and you can set up and everything is a performance there. I guess there's not a lot of danger in doing that when you're a wired. So you get the idea, right? It's really charming in its way, and the surrealists just ate it up, right? Invited him over, wanted him to perform the circus again, right? And again, it's I think this idea of what the circus is to people at the time. Let's see what's coming up next. So, with this interest in this sort of animated circus, and there he is. There's a new article I just read last week, and there are other Calders we see floating around here as well. Very gentle and very quiet person, and I even get the sense as an old man there, that same sense. But when these things were noticed by the surrealists, Duchamp said, "Oh, these aren't sculptures; these are mobiles." He's the one who actually coined the term mobile, right? A mobile sculpture, and this becomes the thing that Calder is best known for, are his mobiles. And obviously, there's the huge one you probably know in the East Building that fills the atrium of the East Building. That was a commissioned work at the end of his life, site-specific commissioned work. But he ends up, let's see, there we are. Working from this original idea of these wire sculptures and the circus into making fixed works of art that are, and I think that we can trace with this all sorts of influences. Certainly the constructivists. We think of Tatlin in particular. We don't have any Tatlins here, but we talked about it. That early constructivist work that was making sculptures that sort of violated and upended all of the rules of sculpture, right? Sculptures sat on a base. Sculptures were solids rather than empty, right? Calders hang on the wall, and they animate the space around them that become every bit as important as the solid pieces of the sculpture, right? So in a way, they're sort of anti-sculptures. Even his wire sculptures are the same thing, right? You can see the kind of constructivist element in that, much like what we saw with Gabo, where the space occupied by the sculpture isn't solid, right? It's suggested by the outlines. And Gabo did this with pieces of celluloid plastic or with nylon wires, right? And Calder is doing it now with bent wire, right? And in this case with hanging things that twirl in the air. And again, there's a sense of randomness, right? This is where the Dada surrealist continuum is so strong, right? That this sculpture looks different every moment you look at it because it changes in front of you. It morphs as you move ahead, right? So the bit on the right, the black bit, as it spins around, is white on the other side. And he's playing not only with the shapes themselves and how they randomly, through no determination of his own, move in space, but also then how the shadows cast by the different elements also become very much a strong part of the sculptural grouping, right? And again, it's that idea that what he's constructing is not just the red sheet on the wall, the things hanging from it, but also is the space around it. It animates the entire space, right? And as we look at this, we can start to say, oh, I'm getting it. I see other things he's doing. You can sort of imagine him having a nice dialogue with Miro, who also had sort of floating biomorphic forms, right, although painted. You can imagine him having a really interesting conversation with Tanguy, very similar to, or even with Dali, right? Although Dali's never very playful, right, in the same way. So it's just absolutely fantastic. And one of the most wonderful things that's happened, I think, in the last year and a half in the DC area art-wise is the revision of the East Wing of the National Gallery. And at the top of one of the towers is a Calder room, a room just full of Calders, right? And I wish I had a picture to show you. The conservators were savvy enough to put in that room a big painting by Miro as well, because the forms that Calder chooses really end up looking like those biomorphic squiggly things that we saw pioneered by Miro, picked up by other artists like Tanguy, right? And now picked up by Calder as well. Now, he doesn't stay in Paris, right? These are back in America. He brings those ideas back after being there for more than a few years, comes back. But even calling it a constellation, right? Remember that Miro had always been fascinated with the heavens as a metaphor, and often made these works where, women or children are staring at a shooting star or standing before the sun, right? And that it became for Miro a form of escape from the trauma of this world, right? Especially during the Spanish Civil War. That's when he really gets on this side and does a whole series of pictures that are called constellations. And Miro, or Calder, is picking up on that, right? And doing these mobiles. Now, these are the mobiles he's most famous for, and the amount of work that goes into something like this is absolutely phenomenal. To get it to balance, right? To know exactly where to bend the loops and have things hooked together so the whole thing hangs in a way that doesn't just careen off to one side, right? Is an incredible amount of meticulous work. And sometimes they hang from the ceiling like this one does. Sometimes they hang from a tripod off the wall, right? Sometimes they're fixed to the floor. Sometimes they'll be fixed to the floor and still move, right? Each one taking these ideas, linking these Miro-like, ARP did them too, Miro-like anamorphic forms and sort of binding them together with these wires that connect them. And in situ, when you see them in the gallery, they end up really occupying the space, right? To the point where the shadow on the wall becomes every bit as important as the work itself. And the two end up working together with, again, this Dada idea of randomness. It's never going to stay the same. He can't control it, right? I thought I'd cut this out, but I didn't. So here's a stabile. He did, if those are mobiles, then the ones that are fixed are stabiles, right? Stabiles. And you can see with all of these that he's working with these forms that he suggests, like Miro's, are constellations, are heavenly bodies. But then I think certainly that there's a war sentiment here, 1943, right? Right in the heart of World War II. And to have a bomb attached to all of this, right, adds to that same theme of sort of the link between the earth, where things are rooted, and the heavens, where things fly, right, float and fly. So he's one of our two sort of end of American surrealists, working primarily in these mobiles, but with these things that are attached by wires, right? And we'll see that there's a legacy on other American artists with exactly this. The other American surrealist that I wanted to wrap up with is Joseph Cornell, and we're really lucky here in a way, and unlucky in another way. The Cornell bequest went to the Smithsonian American Gallery. They have hundreds and hundreds of Cornells. They have so many that they're never out. So there's our yin and yang, right? There's tons of these, but you usually see the same 4 or 5 of them. He's an entirely self-taught artist. He encountered surrealism in a very different way from Calder. He saw it in a gallery. And after seeing some surrealist juxtapositions of objects, he decided he was going to make his own. And he does some collages that look very much like Max Ernst sort of things. He does some other kinds of assemblages that really look very close to European surrealism. But then he has a neighbor teach him how to make boxes, teaches him basic carpentry. And he begins to make these boxes, which become sort of the works that he's best known for. And again, stunning level of meticulousness and craftsmanship put into them. And he would keep trays full of things that he found on the street. Kind of like Schwitter's, right? Again, those connections are all there. Right? But much more organized than Schwitter's. Schwitter's just sort of had like all, and Schwitter's was picky, right? Bus tickets and dry cleaning receipts, right? Theater tickets and whatnot. Cornell is mostly interested in grabbing things for color, and he would keep each of the trays arranged by color tonalities. So when it came time to construct the boxes, he could put them together. Now, that's not to say that he's not interested in the symbolic meaning of the objects as well. And in fact, he very much is. They're really all about memory, right? The theme of memory, so the idea of sand in an hourglass, right? As memory, as sand as what's left when things erode their way down, right? The rocks become sand through the passing of time. And that many of the things he does, he's never going to spell anything out. And that's typical for the surrealists. He's not going to sort of say, okay, this means just one thing, and it's going to be pretty easy to figure it all out. But rather, he makes these allusions to ideas. So allusions to the passing of time through the sand, through the broken glass. There's a sheet of glass in the front as well, right? As you can tell, it's contained, right? But what's interesting with the idea of chance is the curator who picks this thing up and sets it back down again is going to shift the sands. They're going to shake it to get the sand to be just right. So if you see this in the gallery more than once, you might see it with something in there in a slightly different place, right? So the broken glass definitely not only the idea of an hourglass, but also the idea of the fragility of life. You know, the fact that life is precious and indeed can break. And then if we look more closely at things, the newspapers that he has decoupaged onto this wooden frame are all in Italian. And I don't read Italian. So I haven't tried to decipher them, and I haven't read of anybody that has tried to figure out if they're coming, what newspaper story or book they might have come from. But the idea of channeling European literature into this American work of art is again about the sort of the legacy of time, the legacy of humanism, right? The records of human endeavor being brought back together in this work, that even the theme seems to address time, right? And if we look inside the box, I'm sorry, this is a really cruddy old slide, back when I had just a little point-and-shoot camera, right? But can you see what's on the wall on the inside? It's a constellation map, right? It's a map of the heavens. So again, we go back to Calder, we go back to Miro, we go back to this idea of looking at something that's physical, but is metaphysical at the same time, right? Because the heavens are changing all the time in a sort of regularized way, right? But they are to us even today, similar to what they've always been, which is this way of escaping the planet and moving toward the supernatural, right? You don't have to be into astrology to buy into that, Greek mythology to buy into that, right? That the stars and the heavens are something mystical and wonderful. And Cornell is tapping into that, but again, through this sort of interest in humanist learning, right? The history of human. So the works are deceptively simple, right? And I would love to try to make one. Honestly, I'm all thumbs, right? I get glue everywhere. I'm like Homer Simpson when he tries to build the outdoor barbecue and he gets the bricks glued. He's super glue my butt, and he's got stuff stuck everywhere and he can't make it the way it looks. I have this vision that I should be able to get out a saw and do this in no time, But they're deceptively simple. They're incredibly complex, actually. And to pull it together with the different forms to make up these allusions to various meanings is Cornell's great strength. Like I said, we got a lot of them. This is the one that's on your slide list for the final, right? And some of the things on the bottom aren't actually tacked down, right? So that ball that you see here can actually move, right? And I've seen this in some of the other ones where I've got pictures that I've taken at the museum at different times, and all of a sudden something's in a different position on the floor. So it's not necessarily determined. But here he's got soap bubble set, right? First we've got another, that's a lunar map, isn't it, on the background? It looks like a moon map forming the back wall. And then a little globe in the foreground that gives you the sense of the earth and the moon in the heavens, right? And two more glasses filled with coral, it looks like, and a rock, geological samples, right? And up above, little cylinders, almost like bells, right? Coffee cups with that handle. And stenciled onto them are shells, right? Which, if you think about a shell, it's like a soap bubble. It's like a glass. It's something that is made to a very sort of thin surface that contains something else. Especially when you think of nautilus shells, like the one on the far right or the third from the right. Yeah, and we've seen nautilus shells before as this symbol of the golden section, right? As this insight into the riddle of the universe, the math that is everywhere, right? And Cornell is tapping into that as well, and then adds to it these two little soap bubble blowers, right, on either side, attached to the walls. And I'm not quite sure what else is there. What are all those numbers coming down the walls, the side walls of or across the top of the table up above? I don't know. They were meant to be sort of deciphered. And as you do it, right, you got to get engaged with it. You got to spend a lot of time thinking about what is he included here, and what does it all mean within this context. With the idea of the soap bubbles, right? Certainly, the reference to blowing bubbles connects to those two goblets, right? Those two tiny little, what are they? They're like aperitif glasses in the foreground that are filled with something very solid, right? Not filled with something liquid. So they're not being used for their proper purpose. But the idea of what a soap bubble ends up looking like when you blow it ends up looking like a glass, right? In its way. And you would blow a soap bubble the same way that you would blow a glass, right? Glass blowers and whatnot. And it's a long-standing theme that I think Cornell would probably have known, is the idea that the soap bubble, like the broken glass in the previous work, is a reference to the fragility of life. And the long-standing artistic motif, where we see it used by artists to suggest that life is fleeting. Right? Our time on Earth doesn't last, and at any moment, life as we know it could pop. Right? It's gone. And so Chardin, back in during the Enlightenment, right, is giving us this soap bubble blowers, little kid looking one, right? And the glass next to it full of the soapy water, right? Now Cornell translates that, and he makes his two glasses that are there no longer utilitarian, right? No longer can they be used for the soap bubbles, but they're filled instead of something soapy, something solid, something harder than even the glass itself, which I think adds to that sense of the fragility of life. So these are really very deeply thoughtful amalgamations of objects intended to evoke kind of the history and the tradition of humanism. And really inspire us to think about what these different elements, when brought together, what do they mean? And that in itself is what really associates us so very closely with surrealism, right? And like I said, so many of these around the area, I wish we could spend more time looking at them. I wish we could have a class project and try to make one. It would be kind of fun to see if we could. I think it'd be a great project. Well, surrealism leads us really very directly into abstract expressionism. You can see by the dates on these two works that the AbEx movement, as insiders call it, has taken off already as surrealism is churning ahead. And they share quite a bit of inspiration, and many of the core tenets and ideas are shared between the surrealists and the abstract expressionist artists. So Gorky is our first. Just so you know, this was painted near Leesburg. His wife had an estate near Leesburg, and this was painted on the estate. And his attempt here is using very, very washed out paint. So it's oil paint that has turpentine added into it so that it doesn't stay where he paints it. And what he wants the paint to do as it drips and sort of smudges across the surface of the painting, he wants it to emulate the way in which the plants on the family estate grow, right? So think of things like kudzu, vines and whatnot, right, that we see around this area quite a bit. And he's not trying to depict it so much as illustrate its growth patterns through the paint, right? So he's not really trying to depict any particular landscape forms. Now, what makes this similar to surrealism? Maybe you can tell me. What about automatic painting? Right? Remember when we started talking about surrealism, we looked at Masson, André Masson, who, under the tutelage of Breton, André Breton, the one who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, right? Masson was practicing this sort of open start automatic painting, where he's just throwing things down without thinking about illustrating anything, just letting his arm move over the surface, and sometimes throwing sand into the wettened paint, right? All of these elements of Dada chance in this early surrealist work, right? And Breton told Masson that this was a way to get to your subconscious, right? The Freudian subconscious. Well, with Gorky, you can see that on a certain level, this also has that idea of the open start. That with the paint thinned down to this level, there's no way he knows how that's going to run and what's going to happen when it runs together. There's an element of chance and risk involved in starting the picture, because you don't know when the pinks and the greens run together if you're going to get something that doesn't just look like diarrhea, or worse, vomit or something. And it comes off okay, right? But that's that element of chance. And again, it's based on this surrealist idea of automatic painting, right? So remember that for Masson, and again, as written up by Breton, the whole idea is psychoanalysis, right? To get to know yourself better, to get to know the human condition better. And that's also picked up by the abstract expressionists. Most of these guys, well, 3 of them at least, are deeply depressed and in therapy. And Gorky's one of them. And we'll talk more about that in the coming minutes. Just for now, we'll just tease it with that, right? So this idea that there's a connection to surrealism between Abex on the one hand, surrealism on the other hand, raises a couple of major influences on American painting in the 40s that we need to sort of just tease out, and some of it we've already discussed, but I want to just reiterate this idea. The first of these is the importance of, well, maybe I'll say 3 things. Artists who travel, which we saw with Calder, the importance of going to Paris. We saw that with Stuart Davis, who we looked at a while back, right? Artists who make their way to Europe and pick up on modernism there. So that's one kind of important thing, is that you got a number of artists who are going and coming back and bringing ideas back with them. Now, going to my notes, the second thing is European expats in the 1940s. American art in the 1940s becomes not just a bunch of Americans. American art in the 1940s is dominated by a number of established European artists who have come to America in the late 30s and early 40s. And for obvious reasons, right? When Hitler starts to do things like close the Bauhaus and persecute anybody that's making non-representational art, persecuting Jews as well for obviously other reasons, right? Mounting shows of 1936 was the show of degenerate art, where he gathered up all of the great European modernists, put their stuff together in a show that was meant to make fun of them. The next year, over 1,000 works of art were burned in a bonfire. Artists fled Europe as Hitler's power spread. And many of them, a vast majority of them, came to America and to New York City. So when we're talking about sort of whether it's Joseph Cornell or Alexander Calder or in this case Gorky, we got to remember that by 1940, New York City had not only American painters, but Max Ernst was there, right? André Masson was there. Andre Breton, the poet, was there, right? In fact, Gorky was friends with Breton. And it was Andre Breton who actually named this painting, right? The title was given by Breton. So he sees something in it that he wants to give it this sort of non-specified, elusive title, right? 1 Year the Milkweed, which to my mind still doesn't mean anything to me, right? So keep that in the back of your mind, right? American art in the 40s is a melting pot of European traditions that have made their way to America, okay? Particularly in New York. In this respect, the influence of Masson on Gorky via Breton, and again, Masson's there as well, leads to this new version that we see, and what we call it when we're talking about abstract expressionism is action painting, right? Automatic painting when we're talking about the Surrealists, but for Gorky and the Abex people, the term we use for this is action painting. And what we mean by action painting is that the painting is not, the subject of the painting is not representation of anything, but rather the traces of the artist's actions. And I guess any painting is that, right? But this is more obviously that you start to trace the way in which the arms and the hands and the brush move. And what you end up seeing is just it's almost like what do you want to say, like a time-lapse photograph where you would see, if the lens stayed open a long time, you would see the blur from where the motion took place. And you can follow his movements around the canvas, and that's what you end up seeing, as much as anything, are the artist's actions captured within the painting, these traces of activity everywhere we look, right? And it has a sort of an immediacy to it that way, right? It's not an expressionism in the way of German expressionism. I guess the closest analogy would probably be Kandinsky, where the natural world is left behind. But for Kandinsky, it really wasn't about the gesture as much as it was about the color choices and the forms, right? And his musical notations and whatnot. For Gorky, he's leaving these traces behind. It's like, you ever walk on the beach with a stick and you just sort of draw things as you're walking? And you're just leaving a little trace behind of where you've been. It's more like that, right? It has that sense of freedom where it's starting open and just to see what happens as you move across the canvas, right? So European expats bring this now to the Abex people. That's our first thing. The second thing we'll talk about as we look at a second Gorky. He wasn't always abstract, right? Earlier in his career, he was much more figurative. Here he is with his mother. And this points us to the second kind of important influence on American painting in the 40s, right? One is expats, artists from Europe living in New York. The second major influence is museums. The importance of museums. I guess this is a nice thing to tell you guys, especially you guys who study art. You're living in an area full of museums. Take advantage of it, darn it. Get down there, right? Museums were a huge influence on the development of painting in the 40s, and that's rare that we can say that, where the availability of art radically changed the direction of contemporary art. But they start to look at things that are coming available again. Who's Gorky looking at here? For this picture with him and his mom. Who said that? Exactly right, Anastasia, Picasso. In fact, significantly earlier Picasso, right? Picasso from 20 to 30 years earlier than this, and becomes for Gorky an ongoing touchstone. Look at those eyes, right? He's definitely looking at Picasso. Remains a lifelong touchstone for him. Now, Picasso never comes to America for any length of time, any important period, right? His works are available to Gorky through magazine illustrations and museums, right? And in the 1930s, a number of important institutions around New York opened up with collections of modern art, European modern art. Right? And this really helped to cement those artists, like the abstract expressionists, who are doing the most adventurous and risky stuff. Right? So, for example, MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, right, in New York, opened in 1929. Right? Began to mount major exhibitions through the 30s, opening the eyes of people. Prior to MoMA, where could you see European art? You had to know somebody like Stieglitz, who as a dealer had a gallery. He had shows, they were temporary, no permanent collection. And the artists that were around him could be introduced to things. And we saw people like Georgia O'Keeffe, pick up on this. Right? But, right, MoMA opens 1929. All of a sudden, modern art is on permanent display in New York. Right? So it's huge. Okay? NYU, New York University, had a collection called the Gallatin Collection, which also opened up in the late 20s, early 30s, had a ton of pictures by Piet Mondrian, right? Had constructivist art on display all the time, right? The Guggenheim Museum, right, opened in 1936. Wasn't called the Guggenheim yet, right? Solomon Guggenheim hadn't given the money for it yet to change the name to his. But it was what it was called, the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, right? Could it be more abstract, right? And they got tons of Kandinskys, right? So if you start to add these things up, right, what you see in the beginning of the 30s, as we're moving into the 30s, is this influx of availability of modern art to New York artists, right? Add to that the Philadelphia Museum of Art has got a fantastic modern collection, all those Duchamps we talked about, right? Those are going on display right around the same time. The Phillips collection just over here, 1921, right? So 20s and 30s, we start to see the market get flooded. Market's not the right word. The visual spectrum gets flooded with European modern in a way that it hadn't in America prior to this. And artists respond to that, right? So European expats on the one hand, and European art with increased availability on the other hand, play a huge role in the direction, the trajectory of American art in the 30s and 40s. This is part of the upswing of surrealism, and certainly a part of what becomes abstract expressionism. Now, the picture on your right is a memory picture. He painted it when he was older. He paints himself as a child with his mother. His mother is dead by this point. He's an Armenian. He grew up in Turkey. And in 1915, his family had to flee Turkey because of the Armenian genocide. The Turks trying to wipe out every Armenian in Turkey. They went first to Russia, and in 1920 to America. Right? So he is a refugee from the horrors of his homeland. This was painted after arriving in America, 6 years after he arrived in America, in remembrance of his mother, who died in 1919 after fleeing the genocide in Russia of starvation in his arms when he was 15 years old. Right? So this is incredibly horrifying picture of, the moment when she's still alive, right? Happier times before he holds her as she dies when he's 15 years old, right? So a memory painter, a memorial of this horrifying background. And for Gorky, sadly, his life is not a particularly happy thing. Paintings are pretty fantastic. And he goes through a series of sort of metamorphoses in his work toward the thing that we started with, those most famous action pictures. But coming out of this early modern tradition based on Picasso, morphing into, there we are, other kind of quasi-cubist works, right? Could easily have something to do with, Picasso, Braque, Juan Gris, around 1915, 1914, but also maybe slightly constructivist looking as well, again, from all of these different sources that we've been talking about. I didn't show you this before. This is a Miro that's in MoMA. In fact, they acquired this picture in 1934, right? But it's almost the exact same time as our Gorky, and I think you can see the incredible similarity in the arrangement and some of the forms. Now, there's differences, obviously, alongside that. But certainly touching on these works of art that he had available around him, not only in MoMA, right, but also works of art that are being done by Americans based on this as well. These become part of the stew, if you will, that Gorky's working with. The Calder that we just saw, you can start to see some connections, formally speaking, as if this is a painted version of a Calder Stabile, right? And now this one's later, but that's not the only one he ever did. Right? Gorky is picking up on these different influences coming out of Americans responding to European art, and of course he himself responding as well. I also think there's a certain connection in the way he lays out the forms to people like Stuart Davis, who remained incredibly active through the 1930s. Gorky giving us a much more abstract version of the sorts of things we had seen there. And with a title that suggests that we're not meant to be looking for things here, but just understand it as the interplay of forms. Right. So Gorky's responding to a broad range of European art, lived this incredibly tragic life, eventually moving toward action painting as we get to around 1940 or so. Here's another of the action pictures, right? That he's most famous for, where they really have that sense of an open start, unresolved quality that he almost as if he doesn't know where it's headed when he's starting. Let's see here. These pictures from the end of the 1940s gets a little bit darker in tonality, and you can see by looking at these side by side that the bright, vibrant color has disappeared here. Even the colors that we saw with the milkweed picture have become much more somber here. Still legacy of surrealist art in many places that we look within it, but much more gloomy in its color choices. This is because of his life. We started off with this, this horrifying event when he was in his teens, horrifying events, right? Fleeing genocide, and then having his mother die in his arms. Well, things got even worse in the 40s. It's just horrifying what happened to him. In 1946, there was a fire in his studio, and almost all of his paintings that he'd been working on for the last 2 years burned. Like nothing left. Right? Absolutely destroyed. All of his recent paintings, all of his recent drawings, he had nothing, right? And for an artist, this is huge, right? This is like the equivalent of a frost if you're a farmer and killing all of your crops for that year. What are you going to do? You have to start from scratch. And yes, that can be a wonderful thing to start from scratch, but at the same time, how are you going to eat, right? That same year, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. And he had a colonoscopy. Do you know what that is? It's the crap bag. They tie up your colon. You have to defecate through a tube. Right, runs out of your stomach and into a bag. And this is going to spend the rest of his life, right? At the same time his studio burns down. Can you imagine what this would have done to his psyche? Just absolutely horrifying. Then, the next year, right, in 48, he had a serious car wreck, broke his back, paralyzing his painting arm. Shit. Imagine this, right? So now, right, he has to poop in a bag. All of his paintings are gone, and he can't paint anymore. He's got to learn to paint with his other hand. At the same time, his wife started sleeping with his old art professor, and she ditches him and takes the kids with her. Could things get worse for him? And so this is the time when we start to see his pictures really start to look particularly gloomy. I was talking to Tom, who teaches painting here. I mentioned I was going to talk. He goes, "Oh, poor Arshio Gorky," because that's all he could think about. This just rained on him. He eventually killed himself, right? Not too long after all of this, because what else? What else could possibly happen? It just kept going wrong from the mid-40s on. Right? So Abex, which is what we're going to end on, has a sort of a gloomier side to it. A lot of our artists are self-destructive in a number of different ways. The second of our action painters is Willem de Kooning, a Dutchman who has come to New York as well. He arrived in New York in advance of the fascists. He came in 1926, and Holland was occupied in World War II, but that's not why he came. He came significantly earlier. On arriving in New York, Gorky's already there, right? He gets there by 1920. They actually meet up, and they become really, really good friends, Gorky and de Kooning. Both of them are artistically influenced by André Masson and the idea of automatic painting, the open start that might lead us somewhere eventually. But at the same time, de Kooning said, this is a quote, "It's nice to be foreigners meeting in some new place," right? They're just these two expats together. Neither of them, with English as their mother tongue. And he said that Gorky had this amazing ability to hit it right on the head, he said. He just could nail it every time with his paintings. And so both of them are practicing this American version of automatic painting, this action painting that's meant to leave these traces of the artist's activities. The difference, of course, is that Gorky is totally abstract, right? Not any great attempt to represent things as he does his action pictures. They're moods, they are feelings associated with things he's seen, but they're not meant to be representational pictures. Whereas de Kooning is focused not exclusively, but very, very heavily on the human form, and does a series of these images of women, literally hundreds of them, and over decades, all the way into the 1980s. He continues to work this theme repeatedly. Now, we've been talking about what makes American painting, what influences it in the 40s. We talked about expatriated European artists. We've talked about art available in museums. Who do you think he's been looking at? De Kooning. Does he remind you of anybody? Mining back? Kirchner?
Yeah, look at that.
Do you guys buy into that? Kirchner? Consciously ugly? There was a big de Kooning show. Well, guess what? Yeah, Kirchner. Even the color choices, right, which are very sort of disturbing in a way. There was a big de Kooning retrospective at Hirschberg, about 4 years ago, and I was talking to Adam Kovacs in the philosophy department about it. He had taken his daughter, who was at that point like 12 years old, 11 years old, to see it, and she says, "Why do you paint ugly pictures?" And it's a really interesting. We've talked about this before with Kirchner, right? The idea of sort of consciously violating your sense of comfort and wanting to shake you free of it. Now, he doesn't share Kirchner's ideas about this, and I don't know enough about de Kooning. I mean, he was happily married for decades. His wife was a painter as well. Elaine de Kooning was a painter of her own merit. But there's something about his works that are just so extraordinarily violent and angry. And again, action painting is leaving the traces of the artist, right? The traces of the artist's activities. And I've got a quote from him. I'm trying to figure out where it is now. "Art never seems to make me peaceful or pure, he said. Art never seems to make me peaceful or pure. He has a really sort of vigorous, muscular, angry paint application that still reminds us, as did Gorky, of the traces of the artist's actions everywhere we look. Right? Now, certainly like Kirchner, I think he's looking back to primitive woodcuts from early Germany. Being a Dutchman, there was a strong printmaking tradition there as well. But I think he's also, like I said, seeing Kirchner's as well. This Kirchner was actually purchased. I got the date on this, right? Purchased in 1938. It went on first into a public collection that was owned by a private party, and then MoMA got it in 1951, and it's still there today. It's huge. It's about 6 feet across, right? And it's Kirchner at his Kirchneriest, if I can say that, right? Some of the paint squeezed right out of the tube onto the canvas. And again, these mask-like faces that are meant to undermine the social beauty of the figure, right? Here's a close-up, right, where we can see the degree to which the face that de Kooning has owes some legacy back to these kabuki masks that Kirchner deploys quite a bit. Like I said, hundreds of these, right? Images of women, sometimes bust length and seated, like the one on the left with a star over her shoulder. Sometimes almost a complete body. We can see the knees coming out of the dress down below. But again, fragmented in so many different ways. And then menacing and frightening with the dress, with that secondary mouth that seems to be on the stomach of the figure, like some sort of strange medieval creature that you see in Crusader manuals. Right? The woman not meant at all to be beautiful. Now, who else do you think he's looking at? Well, we mentioned Kirchner. Anybody else we can sort of think him channeling in here? Sharp-edged, menacing female forms. Say it. Picasso. Right? Yeah. Right? And again, for our artists in the 40s, many of these works came across as being brand new when these museums opened. You know what I mean? It's their first opportunity to really see them. And the interesting thing about the Demoiselle is that it remained in Picasso's collection. It's a huge picture, it's like, 7 feet square. And it remained in his personal collection up until the 20s. Then it went into a private collection, right? And it wasn't until 1937 that it resurfaced, and MoMA bought it, Museum of Modern Art, put it on display in 1937. But it had really not been seen much at all since it was painted. So from 1907 through 1937, this is a work people have heard about, maybe seen, a little reproduction in a magazine in black and white, in blurry old lithography, right? Not our nice high-resolution images that we're used to. And then 1937, it gets to MoMA, and they have this sort of crash show. And what an amazing impact it must have made as something that's new and fresh that we haven't ever seen before on a scale, right? So when we look at de Kooning and the teeth and the angles and the threat and the danger of the work, certainly Picasso is on his mind, right? In the way in which he fragments the female form. And it's not just old Picasso, right? Early Picasso. He's looking at a lot of Picasso. Because once you see something like this, you start to find out what else he's been doing, right? So there's every chance that he's also looking at things like Guernica, right, which we looked at before. Or here, this makes a really wonderful comparison, doesn't it, right? Much more recent Picasso, but again with the same sort of fragment, more of the sense of the fragmentation that we see here. Now, I don't know enough about de Kooning to tell you this one way or the other, but part of me sees these pictures as being very, very misogynist. The way, and that's something people talk about with the Demoiselle, with Picasso as well, is the degree to which Picasso's own ideas about women come through in the image, and this idea that male artists who fear the power of women, and that the power that women have potentially over men is the power of seduction, right? And that's a trope that goes back through the Middle Ages, right? That the smartest of men will do the stupidest of things when they get winked at. And goodness knows, we're seeing it everywhere now, right? Men who aren't even getting winked at, trying to get winked at, doing dumbass stuff, right? The power of women lies in, for men, for the perception of males, the power of women lies in their ability to seduce. And that is a threat to male power. Okay, now I'm not talking from the way I think. This is the way it can be perceived. These pictures reveal the female threat. They focus on women as a threat to men, whether nude or with makeup. All of these things relate to the idea of seduction and its threat to the masculine status quo, right? Where men are on top of the heap. Now, imagine in a period, 1950s, when gender roles are starting, not a lot yet, but are starting to change. Like when is Betty Friedan? That's like 61 or so, the feminine mystique. Women's roles are still pretty tightly controlled, but we're starting to see women with more autonomy within society. So one has to imagine that images such as these, right, might in part be motivated by that perception of threat. Again, I don't know enough about de Kooning. I've not read enough of his writings to know much more about this. I do know his wife, very successful painter like he was, right? As successful as he was, Elaine de Kooning, painted regularly. Is he feeling threatened? I'd like to find out more, right? But it's distinctly possible. What I do want to talk about with him is a different kind of psychoanalysis. He was undergoing psychoanalysis, as was Gorky. A kind of psychoanalysis that was inspired by the philosopher Carl Jung. Jungian analysis, rather than Sigmund Freud, right? So Sigmund Freud's whole shtick, if I could do it in a sentence and a half, right, is that if I could get to your subconscious, those ideas from childhood that you've sublimated as an adult, okay? Sort of the kind of free will you exercise as a kid, that we learn not to exercise as adults. If we can get back to that primal experience from our earliest years that's available through our subconscious, we can understand then the problems that we encounter dealing with day-to-day stuff, because it's that suppression of our human urges that's leading us to our anxieties. Okay, in a nutshell. Right? And by the way, deeply flawed as a distillation of Freudian psychology into 25 words. Okay? Jung believes in something different. Okay? Freud's the subconscious. That's individual to each one of us, right? My subconscious is not necessarily the same as yours, right? It's my issues, it's my, right? The unconscious is something that we share, according to Jung, right? The collective unconscious is, and again, how to say this without sounding like some sort of spiritualist from upstate New York. The collective unconscious is part of your mind, my mind, our mind, that is connected back to our earliest ancestors. That from our legacy, from our inheritance, going back to primal man, we all share a collected experience that's been passed down to us over the ages. an ancestral memory that everybody shares. The collective unconscious. And we are simply not conscious of it. Now, how do we get conscious of it? How do we discover that shared collective experience? Well, according to Jung, there were a couple places where you can find it. One through study, the other one through activity. Through study, you can find the collective unconscious in different cultural mythologies. Okay? So when a culture writes its stories about gods, about creation, that's one place where the collective unconscious is manifested. And this is why creation stories are so similar in different cultures. This is why, the myth of the hero going to conquer the monster takes on sort of the same sort of pattern. Whether you look at ancient Greece or Beowulf, there's just a shared pattern there, because what's happening, what makes them so similar, is that they are giving us a small view into the collective unconscious. Okay? The other way, rather than studying, is to be aware of your unplanned actions. The things that you do in a non-predetermined way. And that when you act on impulse, when you act without rational deliberation, your actions are guided by your collective unconscious. You're a part in that. Right? And then what they said is that, what Jungian psychoanalysis says, is that you need to understand those actions. And if you can understand those actions, you can have another window into this shared humanity, this collective unconscious. Right? And they call it self-actualization. Is that awareness of your own actions and whether or not they can be a way in which we can get insight into something that's greater than ourselves. Okay? If we come back to action painting, right? There we are. Open-ended starts. Actions that leave a trace that you can then go back into and determine what those traces lead us to. That's Jungian Psychology 101. Right? That's what abstract expression is kind of all about, is using the painting to bring out these ideas that you don't know that are there when you start. Whether it's Gorky or de Kooning, although I think de Kooning knows he's going woman, he just doesn't know exactly what it's going to end up looking like. And by the way, these are all on a fairly massive scale. These de Koonings are about 5-6 feet tall, right? The Gorky's a little bit smaller, but most of the people that we're talking about in this movement of action painting are working very large, because what they're doing is the canvas becomes who they are. The canvas becomes all of their experience. If you're going to work on a 7-foot canvas and you're in there making these gestures, then you've entered into a world. You've entered into an atmosphere, a realm, right, that almost entirely surrounds you, certainly fills your visual field. Right? So with this idea of Jung, the collective unconscious, the idea of self-actualization, the actions are providing insight into something beyond our immediate experience. Right? Something that is the shared humanity, the shared unconscious of everybody. The artist that should immediately come to mind is Jackson Pollock, right? The famous drip painter, right? Never touches the canvas with the paintbrush, at least not in his mature phase, and is definitely action painting with a capital A, right? Also in psychoanalysis, had a Jungian therapist, so very much interested in self-actualization. What do my actions mean? Right? That's in a nutshell. What do my actions mean? And that's what the painting really is all about. Right? Show you two quick pictures and then we'll quit. So there he is in his studio. He painted on the ground the non-stretched canvases nailed to the ground. You can go visit his studio in Long Island and see the areas where the drips went outside the paint, right? But using not fine paint, but often house paint, industrial paint, right? Sometimes they're silver, right? Sometimes they're tar-based, and dripping. Surprised things didn't light on fire, right? But what's fascinating about this is he's leaning over with cigarettes, and sometimes you find things in the paint that dripped, fell while he was working, right? And we'll look at those. But just for a sense of scale, right? To keep in mind that these things are done on a mural scale. Right? They are trying to create something more than a decorative wall piece. They really believe these to be more. And for Pollock and action painting and the idea of self-actualization, the scale of the work is an important part of that. Because in doing so, you become one with the work. Your actions are everywhere to be seen. So let's see. Friday we'll look at Pollock. Who else do I got coming up? After Pollock, we got a couple of field painters, right? Rothko, in particular, will be on Friday. We'll have hopefully a chance at the end of all of that to talk a little bit about the exam. So look over the slide sheet and everything. Come armed with questions on Friday about the exam. We might start with that and then go into the paintings. That seems like a better way to go. Okay. Work hard on your papers. Good luck with that. And for those of you that are just coming in late, I'll get those to you as soon as I possibly can. Okay.